Welcome to Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast produced by Equivon Corrections, where we discuss industry trends, hot button issues, and solutions that impact facilities nationwide with thought leaders from around the country. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Priscilla Torres, project manager at Equivon Corrections and your host of Inside Out. Today, we're diving into the culture of corrections and what it really looks like beyond policy and procedure. Corrections culture is shaped by constant movement, high-pressure decisions, and day-to-day interactions between staff and inmates. It impacts safety, morale, and how the job actually gets done. So what defines that culture and what needs to change? Let's get into it. Today on the show, we have David Rugaber, who is the Deputy Director of the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office Detention Bureau. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Priscilla. Very happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the industry and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure. This is going to be a long and winding road, so buckle up, I suppose. So I actually was a college student at a local university here. I was attending on an academic scholarship. I was going for a civil engineering degree. It didn't work out so well for me. I probably should have picked a different major. And we had a young family, and I realized that probably engineering was not going to be for me. And I needed a job that had decent pay. I needed a job that had good benefits, good health insurance. And a friend of mine recommended corrections. I had never thought of corrections at all as a career. And so nobody thinks about a correction officer. So I thought I'd give it a shot. I looked at the benefits. I thought it was right for my family at the time. And at the time, you had to take a very long test. There was a 5-hour test. There was a 3-hour psychological test and a 2-hour written test, which looked at your reading and writing skills and your math skills, et cetera. I was fortunate enough. I actually finished number one out of 250 applicants, and I was chosen. And I came aboard as a correction officer, not knowing what to expect. We all look at the profession, I think, on what we see on television, right?
Right.
You're walking around with keys and you're handing food trays through a food chute. And, it's not a glamorous portrayal on TV, certainly. So I really had no idea what to expect. I went through the academy first. At the time, I think it was a 3-week academy. We're now in the state of Wisconsin, it's a 200-hour academy. It's a 5-week academy. There was very little training at the time. I think I got trained more by the inmates than I did by our staff about how to be a CO. So, we're talking 1999, January of 99. So it was a while ago. I'm in my 28th year now. So I had the opportunity to work as a correction officer. I've worked as a sergeant, lieutenant, captain. I was at another facility before I came over here to the sheriff's office in Milwaukee County, the House of Correction. And I was an assistant superintendent over there. And the sheriff was opening up a new spot, a deputy director position over here at the sheriff's office. And I had communicated with the sheriff before, and I know her to be an honorable person. And I knew a lot of the command staff over at the sheriff's office. So I decided to dip my toe in the water in a different institution. That was in February of 24. And here we are. So here we are, 28 years later, and I'm a deputy director in charge of operations over the jail at a new facility, which was both familiar and strange at the same time. It's a lot more complex. There's a different function where the House of Correction is usually sentenced individuals, and you're looking at rehabilitation and reintroducing them back into the community. And the jail is, they take people off the street. When they're first arrested, it's a more difficult time, obviously, for inmates when they're off the street the first 48 hours compared to the House of Correction where they're already sentenced. So, they're a little more difficult environment in terms of inmates. It's more complicated because you have the records department, which oversees all the release dates and making sure that people are detained properly, released properly. So I'm still learning. I mean, you never stop learning in this profession, right? But
No,
it was an interesting road. So I hope I haven't talked too much. I hope it wasn't
no,
too complicated. But here we are.
no, that's great. It sounds like you've had an array of, wide array of experience, just, in different areas, which, is quite impressive. You didn't just, just stay on the line, right? You did a little bit of everything. So, that has probably helped you get where you are today. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. So as you know, our topic today we'll be discussing the culture of corrections. So I want to ask you, David, when you hear the term culture of corrections, what does that mean to you in practical terms?
Boy, that's an interesting question. So the culture of corrections, it probably can harken back to, what is the overall purpose? Back in the day, I feel like it was more about just housing individuals here until it was time for them to be released. That's no longer the case. We've evolved a lot since those days. We recognize the reasons why people are incarcerated. You try to alleviate those instances, right? So somebody who, for example, they're here on retail theft and they've come into custody 3, 4, 5 times and they're just a regular, not knowing that the impetus behind those arrests were they had drug addiction and they were breaking into houses or, stealing from stores so they could sell those items so that they had money to fuel their drug addiction. So if we have right now, for example, we have a MAT program, medically assisted treatment program, that gets to the root cause and helps people overcome their addiction, and they're not going to break into houses, they're not going to steal, and they're not going to come back into jail. And we didn't have a MAT program, when I first started. We have programs that look at job skills, to making sure that people know how to fill out a resume. There are a lot of people that don't. Things that you and I take for granted.
Right.
People don't have that skill set necessarily. How to interview, how to dress for an interview. The importance of a high school diploma or a GED. A lot of times, decades earlier, that wasn't something that was really focused on, and now it is. So I think the culture of corrections is more geared towards rehabilitation than simply housing somebody until their release date.
Okay. So for someone that's never worked inside a jail and is maybe considering it, I know you knew very little, right, about working inside corrections when you first stepped foot. I know that you mentioned that earlier. How would you describe the culture inside a typical correctional facility or a jail to someone who's never been inside one?
Boy, there's nothing like it. I don't think there's anything that can prepare you for the atmosphere inside a jail, inside a housing unit. It's very, very unique, which of course is why training is of the utmost importance. It can be. You're in an environment where you're overseeing individuals who don't necessarily hold you in high regard, right? I mean, they're there against their will. So they can be acting in a negative way towards a correction officer, especially if you're new. If you're new, they don't know who you are. They're going to try to take advantage of you any way they can. And that's scary to a new officer. So they have to have that support system with their coworkers, with their supervisors. And it goes all the way up to my position and then my boss, the director, and they take their cues from us. So it can be very, very challenging. You have to have a good support group. And you have to have a good support group outside of corrections as well. You don't want corrections to become your life, inside these walls and outside these walls, because this job will change you. And that's something I think when we talk about culture in corrections that you have to be aware of. Like, it's going to change you, and sometimes in a fundamentally important way. You become more hypersensitive. Hyper aware, I should say.
Hypervigilant.
Hypervigilant. You are, and if I forget, there's an example I have of that where actually it was very beneficial. But you're going to find yourself when you go into a restaurant or you're in an elevator, your back is always going to be towards a wall because you feel more comfortable. You're going to be watching the crowd if you're in a restaurant or a mall or at a festival a little more closely than you would if you weren't involved in corrections. That's just the way it is. You're going to have sometimes a more negative view on society because you're dealing with the worst that society has to offer sometimes, and that can kind of carry over into your private life, and you have to be very careful of that. It is rewarding. You do change lives here. You will see inmates when they're released on the outside. And I've never had a negative interaction with an inmate that I've seen on the outside because I always treat people fairly, right? Firm but fair is what we say.
Right.
And it's the absolute truth. You have to have a very steady personality when you're inside a housing unit so that the inmates know what to expect. And the one thing that they always want to say to me is how they're doing, and that they're doing much better than when they were in prison or their life was before they were arrested, and they benefited from their time, and they want to thank me for how I treated them. And that's the rewarding part, right? That knowing that you made a difference in somebody's lives. But to answer your question again, it's a negative environment. There's no way around that, and you have to find ways to alleviate that. And if that's by making sure that you have family time on the outside, you're talking to friends who are not in corrections. That's always important.
Right.
And to make the environment as rewarding as it can be.
So I know that there's policy, right? And that, I know you said training earlier, that kind of, helps guide you during your career while you're working as a corrections officer. But I know there's a subculture that exists, and I know that you kind of, touched on that. What would you say are some of the unwritten rules that define how things actually operate inside a facility, if you're working inside the facility?
I tried to control the housing unit as best as I could, and make sure that the inmates knew that I was in charge, and I was not going to call a sergeant for them. I was not going to call a lieutenant for them. It was my housing unit, and I was going to control it, and they had to deal with it, or they were going to go to the cell block, right? I mean, that was me. So those are some unwritten rules: that you control your unit, you don't ask for help. You make sure that you create that atmosphere and it's conducive to how you want to run it. And as I mentioned, you have to be the same, every day when you come in. That's important too. You can't let those emotions kind of rule your day in the housing unit, because that'll make your situation that much worse. So if there's one unwritten rule, I mean, that's what I would say is you have to be steady in your approach to the job.
So I know that one of the bigger issues jails are facing across the U.S. is, staffing. Staffing tends to be a challenge, and, or you have a high turnover at some facilities, Would you say that some of that is related, or how would you describe, maybe, do you think that the culture that exists, that subculture that exists inside the correctional facility, perhaps, influences some of these individuals, maybe in a negative way, to leave? This isn't for me. I mean, how quickly does someone new, right, that you hire, a staff, adapt to that culture that exists? Because it exists at every facility.
Right.
Some of it's good, some of it's bad. It just depends.
I would say not until at least a year. And I would say that because in that year, you will have gone through the Jailer Academy. So you'll have a more complete picture of corrections, the legal ramifications, right? Why we do what we do. You'll have the official training with the field training officer program. And you get settled in. You'll be on the shift that you're going to be on for a while. You get used to the overtime. I think universally overtime is an issue. You get used to missing birthdays. You get used to missing anniversaries. You get used to working on weekends. You get used to working 16-hour shifts. That all takes a while, and again, that's something that is really unlike a lot of other professions. So it has settled in by that time, that shock, right, to your schedule. And more importantly, your family adjusts to that as well. So if it's your anniversary, you're like, look, I mean, it's technically our anniversary today, but let's celebrate, on this day when you're guaranteed to have an off day. Let's do that. Or, hey, make sure you burn a personal day because it's so-and-so's birthday and we want to be there. You get used to planning ahead. You get used to having an overtime buddy. Where you say, look, I need this day off. If I get forced, will you take it? They agree. And then in return, you do the same favor with them. So having an overtime buddy is always important. You mentioned the turnover, and that goes back to, first of all, hiring the right people. In the hiring process. And I'm someone who I make the hiring decisions. I go through the background folders along with my boss, the director, and you kind of get a feel with who can do this job and who can't. You can't reject anybody illegally, of course, but you have to understand that, you would rather run short than run with people who are not built for the job in corrections. Because once you start hiring people who are underqualified, that's going to lead to issues within the house or within the facility. You're going to have individuals who, maybe are prone to taking shortcuts. Maybe they lash out at coworkers. They can't take the pressure. They're going to be calling in sick all the time and getting other individuals mandated for overtime. And we can go back to the unwritten rules, right. Priscilla. So don't call in on holidays, right? That's an unwritten rule. If it's Christmas, you do not call in on Christmas. You do not call in on Thanksgiving. And that was a very strong unwritten rule when I first started. Unfortunately, it's kind of lapsed a little bit, and now it's not seen as being as taboo as it was, but that's still one of those unwritten rules. And you want to make sure that you don't hire individuals that are going to be of that mindset. And that's going to help in turnover, even though you're going to be running short until you can get those good individuals in here. That eventually will help, because coworkers will get frustrated at individuals such as this, and they're going to start looking for other employment. So they want to work with people who are going to have their back if the situation goes bad, right? If it goes south, and if they know they can't depend on people, well, you're talking about their safety. And once they feel that their safety is a concern, they're going to be looking for other employment, and you just can't have that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, those are all good points. And you just mentioned a really good point, the safety piece, right? So if you hire, it kind of sounds like you're saying, out of desperation, you need to fill some spots, or you start kind of getting lax on your requirements. How could that compromise the safety of the staff, inmates, and security as well? I mean, how could that impact that piece?
Sure. And it opens you up to legal liabilities as well. So I'm sure everybody's familiar, right? We call it the warm body theory.
Yeah.
So number one, if you hire somebody who doesn't come to work, and we mentioned that, it's going to increase that unanticipated overtime. I mean, if you're short, usually you get mandated a couple days in a row, and it's going to happen, and you can figure it out with your family. You can figure it out with your overtime buddy, like I mentioned. But if you have somebody who just calls in an hour before their shift, right, and that creates overtime at the last minute, and that's bad for morale. That's not good for you. That's not good for your family. It's not good for the institution. Maybe you didn't pack an extra lunch because you didn't expect to get mandated. You're working on very little sleep, and that's going to be an issue. Security wise, you have somebody who doesn't have the situational awareness to recognize if they're in danger, or the situational awareness to see if their partner is in danger. I mentioned that hypervigilance. If you have somebody who is not prepared to be a correctional officer, and maybe they're reading a book, maybe they're reading a magazine, maybe they smuggled in a cell phone and they're looking at their cell phone and not looking at their partner while their partner is doing rounds. That definitely endangers somebody's safety. If it's somebody who doesn't recognize that an inmate is in peril, right? An inmate can talk about Maybe there's a medical emergency and the officer doesn't react to that medical emergency. They're not doing the rounds correctly. When you do your rounds, you have to make sure that you're looking for signs of life, and they're being lazy and just walking past the cell door. These are all issues that could present themselves if you hire the wrong people and if you don't have a good training program in place to make sure they're trained properly and recognize if they're not reacting to training. It affects everybody when you hire people who are of low quality. Again, you'd rather run short than run with hiring just warm bodies.
Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, is brought to you by the professionals at Equivon Corrections. As a team composed of former corrections practitioners, Equivon Corrections provides specialized classification and custody management solutions. From the industry-backed, proven decision tree classification instrument to alternative screenings and robust reporting capabilities, Equivon Corrections provides dedicated solutions to help facilities and corrections departments nationwide become safer and more streamlined. To learn more or schedule a demo today, visit www.equivon-corrections.com.
I know you mentioned a few things, right? You mentioned smuggling a cell phone. You're dealing with inmates on a daily basis, right? Some facilities are strictly direct supervision, right? So you spend more time actually with the inmates than you do with your colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And I know part of training, for a lot of facilities is really, knowing that inmates are going to try everything and anything, right, to get you to do something. So, one of those things that you brought up was, smuggling a cell phone. Do you believe that could also impact smuggling other things or easily being influenced by inmates or manipulated by them?
No, that's a really good point, Priscilla. Absolutely. And again, I was in internal affairs for 8 years, so I've seen a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And you're right. And it's not just the newer officers that can be opened up to manipulation by the inmates. Traditionally, it is, right? That's where you see it the most, where you see officers who want to please the inmate. Hey, look, this guy does a good job cleaning up in the housing unit for me, so I think I'm going to bring in some gum for this individual, right? I think I'm going to bring in some cookies. That's how it starts. And I actually did have a case like that where it started off with gum, and then it was food, and then it became pornography, and then it became drugs, right? And then who knows where it was going to stop. And luckily, this individual was caught before anything like that could happen. But that's universal. That's across, quite a few. If not, all jails, you see that. But that's something that we have to be aware of when we do the interviews for the position before they're hired. We have to make sure they have that strong personality where they're not going to be manipulated. Make sure that they look at you in the eye when they're talking, right? They're not looking at the ground. They don't have that low key voice, and they have that alpha mentality, is what you want. And that's difficult to find sometimes. We have also seen officers who are plants where, local gangs will try to get somebody to apply for the job, somebody that has no criminal history, but they have a relationship to the gang, and they try to get them hired for the sole purpose of smuggling in contraband. And that's where the background process comes in. And you have to make sure that as best you can, you weed out those individuals, and you can find them through inmate phone calls, for example. You find that this person has been contacting or been contacted by inmates in the facility, and this was the plan all along. It's a very important process. It's a very difficult process, but there are many firewalls that could be put in place, right? It's the background process, it's the orientation process, it's the FTO process, the supervisors, paying close attention to all their staff members, and hopefully there's no bad outcome because you've weeded out those bad apples through multiple layers of protection.
Right. No, those are all good points. I mean, and I think it's become a little more difficult perhaps for, facilities and, in hiring, right? Because there's mandatory overtime. You probably spend more time at work than you do with your own family at some facilities. So, making sure that you have the right individuals there will really make a huge difference. So, with that said, though, I know you mentioned veteran staff. What role would you say that like senior officers or, veteran staff or tenured staff play in shaping that culture?
A huge part, especially once the trainees get out of the academy, which kind of presents things in a utopian way, right?
Right.
And they go from the academy to real life. And a lot of times the veteran officers can drive people away, or they could kind of save the day by taking them under their wing. When I was a new officer, again, this is a long time ago, but there was a lot of staff members that would not even bother to learn your name until you had been around for 6 months. And they would tell you this: look, I don't care who you are. You talk to me in 6 months, and then, maybe we can communicate together. That doesn't make you feel great. And that
No.
makes you question if you chose the right profession or the right institution. So we do have conversations with our veteran staff, and they have to understand that if they want the overtime to go away, these are the individuals who are going to be taking your shifts. These are the individuals who are going to make sure that we're not 100 hours short on a particular schedule and we have to give out 100 hours of mandatory overtime. These are the individuals who are going to save your butt if things go bad in a housing unit. They're going to be coming to your rescue. So your well-being depends on how well officers are being trained and how you are as an FTO. So we just started a brand new FTO process where we have officers go through official training, and they mimic what's called the San Jose model, which is typically used in law enforcement. Interestingly enough, there is no official FTO program that's geared strictly towards corrections. And Priscilla, if you talk to anybody who's got one, great. I'd love to hear from them, but I've not found one at all. And we've had to modify a law enforcement specific FTO program, to corrections. And when they go through the class, it's all of this is drilled down into them, and you want to make it as voluntary as possible, for veteran staff to mentor the newer staff. And it's tough because veteran officers have the shortcuts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that probably helps you all understand, hey, where are we struggling? Where are the gaps? And where are weak points as well? It's interesting that, you hire someone new and, the biggest complaint you hear inside is, the overtime, right? But you bring someone new in and, you're right. Some of these veteran staff won't even acknowledge you until you're off probation, maybe, because trust seems to be an issue, right? And you said something important earlier, these are the individuals that are going to have your back, So with that said, what does it take for someone to be accepted within the staff subculture that exists inside corrections?
So number one is come to work. The one thing that the staff is going to see, if they see that you're an attendance problem, that you're calling in with regularity, you're not going to get that support. You have somebody who has been around for years and they've missed all this time with their family, and they look at you coming on board and you're calling in on holidays, you're calling in on weekends. That's not going to sit too kindly with the veteran staff. So number one is come to work. Number two is to actually learn your job and be serious about the job. There are, new people when they're hired, and you can kind of tell that they're here for a paycheck. They're not here for the job itself. They're not here to look at this as a career. This is maybe a temporary job, and they're looking to go in somewhere else. And the veteran staff can pick up on that, knowing, well, you're not going to be around long. You don't care what happens to me. And that's going to be reciprocated. So you have to come to work. You have to care about the job. You have to do the job right. And I think that, you have to make sure that you have the support of the supervisor. So when the supervisors come in, they're not correcting you all the time. And I'll give you a very specific example would be if you are assigned to, first shift, and you don't do a good job of making sure that the rules are enforced where, the inmates have wristbands, right? The inmates are properly dressed. Everything is clean. And you come in on second shift and the rules were not enforced, you have to clean up after that officer. Now you have to make sure everything is cleaned properly. Now you have to make sure that your count is correct. A lot of time, a newer officer, again, doesn't pay attention and they'll give you an incorrect count. And if you do that with regularity, you're definitely not going to be accepted by the staff because they know that you make more work for them. The job is difficult enough. And if you cut corners and you allow the inmates to act any way they act, and you come in and you try to enforce the rules, and they're like, hey, why are you enforcing the rules when this officer didn't do that? We like this other officer better. We're going to give you a hard time because you're enforcing what needs to be done. So that's another thing that we find with the newer officers, to make sure that they're on point, to make sure that they treat the job with respect. They treat the other officers with respect, and you do that by being consistent and following policy and procedure.
Firm, fair, and consistent is what we used to say. Firm, fair, consistent.
Yes.
Absolutely. So I know that you mentioned earlier that you've, worked at a couple facilities. And I hear this often as I traveled, to different jails across the U.S. Sometimes outsiders aren't welcome, especially if they come from another facility, because there's an existing subculture amongst the officers. How difficult is it to shift or disrupt an established subculture, especially if it's not a positive one, right? It's negative. How difficult is that? I don't know if you've experienced that, but
it was a little easier for me coming from the House of Correction, which is now known as the Correctional, the CRC, the Community Reintegration Center is their new name. But I had the benefit of working with some individuals at the captain's level and some at the officer's level who had worked with me before at the old facility. So they recognized me and they could kind of telegraph to other staff members what to expect when I came aboard. So I got a pretty good welcoming when I came here. Now, there are definitely some rules that I wanted to enforce that I got a lot of resistance with. And eventually, it leads to discipline, unfortunately, but people have to realize that you're serious. And it's for the benefit of the agency. And I call it a 5-year plan, right? I'm in year 2.5. So I'd like to think I made a lot of differences over here. And I've changed the culture quite a bit for the positive. And the biggest part was to come in here and not make extreme changes right away. It's important to recognize how they do things, why they do things, and respect that, because there's a reason why certain protocols are in place. But with that being said, you also have to make the established supervisors here question, why have we always done it this way? Maybe it's not the best way of doing things. And change is very difficult, as you hinted, Priscilla.
Everybody wants change, right? But when change comes,
it's terrible. And some people I had to drag kicking and screaming, and they had to have discipline meted out as part of this before they would recognize that this isn't going away. What I heard is when I came here was, flavor of the day. This is flavor of the day. And a lot of people, I think, when they come into new institutions are going to hear that. Well, they'll try to implement this for a week. They'll forget about it. And we can go back to how we did things. And you have to make sure that that does not happen, that you're on it every day. You're on it every week. 6 months from now, you're still on it. A year from now, you're still on it. And when new changes come about, they're like, oh, okay, well, the deputy director, he's not going to play with this. He's going to make sure that it's done. We better go ahead and do it because he's going to be on us for a year, to make sure that these changes are put in place. And of course, it's the buy-in. We're doing it this way because. And a lot of times, again, when I was coming up, it was just do it. This is the way we're going to do it. Don't ask why. You're going to do it because I said so. And there's still a lot of that in corrections culture, because I said so. So especially with the younger generation, they always want to know why.
Why?
And we have to explain to them, to the supervisors, look, eventually you're going to have to say why. You don't have to say why at the time you give the order, but eventually you're going to have to do that. And that's, merging, the old culture with the expectations of the new generations coming in, you're going to have to do that. And maybe it's uncomfortable. You have to be certain in your commands that you give. But there's going to be a time eventually you're going to have to circle back and say, hey, remember that time? And you asked me why? This is why.
This is why. So what I heard you say basically is accountability is important, right? And if you come into a new place, you should always observe first and try to learn and then implement your changes afterwards. And then being consistent within those changes, right? Like you said, flavor of the day, flavor of the week, they'll forget about it. You have to remain consistent in whatever changes you're making or whatever you're trying to implement. And then getting that staff buy-in. And how do you do that? You're transparent, you explain why. I know you can't always go in depth, but really pushing that down, especially to this newer generation stepping into the corrections field. Right.
Right. And I think getting opinions from all ranks also matters too. So if I come out with a directive now, I mean, a lot of times, or I would say almost every time, I get direct feedback from the captains, lieutenants. I get feedback from officers, from the sergeants, and everybody needs to feel that their opinion is valued and that they can make a difference. So a lot of the major decisions that come down, I've already gotten feedback from definitely the captains and from the lower ranks as well.
So getting that input, that buy-in from them as well, because they're the ones that are going to actually roll out a lot of these changes and make sure that they're complying, that all staff are complying with them. So, I mean, you've kind of touched on a lot of points here, and I think one of the things we haven't discussed is really how does the corrections culture impact mental health for staff, right? So mental health is, I think there's more awareness, within the last, few years about, the burnout that corrections officers experience and, the post-traumatic stress that's also associated with the job, right? But how would you say the culture overall, is there anything else that you would say kind of impacts that mental health for staff?
I had to do a presentation before the mental health task force for the state of Wisconsin. And I did some research as to mental health and the mental health of corrections officers. And here's where I don't think that corrections officers get enough credit for the job that they do, and that the public does not quite understand, nor do I think law enforcement, about how difficult corrections really is. So the suicide rate, there are studies out there that show that the suicide rate for corrections officers are 39% above those of the general public. Alcoholism rates are higher. Divorce rates are higher. You mentioned PTSD. PTSD is actually higher amongst correction officers, veteran correction officers, than it is for law enforcement. And there are studies out there to show that PTSD, and this is going to be controversial, and I wish I had that here before me, but I could probably send you that after the fact, after this interview, that corrections officers have PTSD at a higher clip than armed forces who went into Iraq, into combat. And it makes sense if you think about that, because you're doing 8, 12, 16-hour shifts with people who don't like you, and there's the threat of violence like all the time for your entire shift. Where with law enforcement, and my brother is a retired police officer, and I've talked to him about this, and he always says, look, I arrest the guy and I give him over to you, and then you deal with him for months, years, whatever it is. But, my association with this person lasts, maybe hours, right? And that's it. And then I'm on to the next. So it is difficult. And I mentioned before how we're alpha personalities, and alpha personalities are famous for not seeking help on their own. So that's one thing.
Yeah, so the help piece, I want to touch more on that.
Yep. So the help piece.
Is there a stigma? I've always heard there's a stigma around asking for help in this profession. So can you
100% there is. There's definitely a stigma that you're weak if you get mental health help, and there's something wrong with you, and they kind of look at you like a leper, right? A little differently. So it's important, and I think we're recognizing that more and more and more, right? We have an established peer support group here. Peer support is actually kind of guided by state statute. There's state statutes in Wisconsin that talk about peer support. We have mental health professionals here through an organization that we've contracted with that individuals can go and seek help. We, of course, have EAP, as most institutions do, but and I'll put this out on your podcast. Like we talk about, seeking help, and I've told roll call this numerous times. I tell a group of new hires this. I see a therapist because I've been in this business for 28 years and it's affected me, and I need an outlet, and I'm definitely the better person for it. So if you have somebody from administration telling people that this is normal, that this is okay, maybe it'll allow for one or two or three or five more people to say, well, if the deputy director is open about this and he acknowledges how this industry has affected him and he's getting help, maybe it's okay if I do too. I encourage all correctional facilities to have something in place where if you don't have an official peer support program, that's very easy to do. Just make sure that your peer support members have official training and how to do that. Make sure that there's that confidentiality piece, because that's the biggest issue that we have with peer support, right? And I've not seen peer support violate that at all, but that's always something where people kind of have that stigma. I'm not going to talk to so-and-so because they're going to tell everybody, right? Yeah. Or they're hesitant. Sometimes, we contract, or, we would go to another county and we would look at, hey, neighboring county, you have a peer support. Would it be okay if we give out your peer support members information so our people can contact your people, and then your people can contact our people, right? So you can do that. You have, a chaplain program where, we put a chaplain program in place. And it's important, if you do that you have a chaplain strictly for the staff and a chaplain for the inmates. It cannot be the same chaplain because, again, you're going to have those trust issues. Both for the inmates and the officers, right? So you have to have separate chaplains for both. That's very, very important. And if you have the wherewithal in your budget, I think hiring a mental health professional just for staff would be beneficial. I would think also, and some institutions do this, and where you make it mandatory. It's called checkup from the neck up, and it's mandatory that your officers go and they have a 1 hour session or however long it is with a psychological professional, a mental health professional. And that way, those alpha personalities who think it's weak, right? They say, well, man, you know what? They're making me go see this shrink. I don't want to see the shrink, but they're making me. Right. I don't want to get written up. I don't want a suspension. So I'm going to go, secretly wanting to go. And that way they can save face. So if there's any institution that can actually do that and make it mandatory on an annual basis, I highly encourage that.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things I hear just from talking to people that work in the field, and when I worked in the field, was it wasn't always easy, right? I had those peers that would call me and kind of vent after their shift, and they had seen some things that, everyday people don't see it on a regular basis, right? And it was very difficult to go back home and, they're dealing with all of that. They're carrying that with them, but they can't really vent to their family members because they don't understand, right? So if you do have that support internally, like a professional, right, mental health professional or a peer support program, that kind of gives the staff an opportunity to kind of get some of that stuff off their chest and, and develop some healthy coping mechanisms as well along the way.
Right. I heartily agree with that, because here's what's going to happen too, is when you first start here and you're going to you see a lot of wild stuff, and you go home and you tell your family all about it. Right. You tell your friends all about it when you go to the bar and whatever. And hey, you can't believe what happened at work today. But you're talking about that because it's so new and it's so unusual and nobody else has these experiences. But what's going to happen over time, and this 100% happens with me, Hey, what happened at work today? Nothing. Now, there may have been, a Narcan incident where somebody was brought back to life and they were Narcaned and a life was saved. And, you're not going to mention that. Maybe there was a fight and it was really brutal and, somebody got seriously hurt. To you, you're not going to mention that as anything out of the ordinary. And you get that cumulative trauma, right? You see this
Right.
time and time and time again, and you don't have anybody to talk to because you're tired of talking about work with your spouse or with your family or with your friends, and you start to internalize that, and there's no outlet, and this can go on for months or years, and that's what happened with me. I still don't talk about my job with my wife. I mean, she knows better to ask me how work was. I don't talk about it at all. My friends stopped asking me about work, right? I mean, because I don't want to, I shift that and ask them about their job. I'm more interested in what happened with you, and I don't want to talk about my job at all, about events that occur, about how it's affecting you, about your feelings, because internalizing it it's just going to make it worse and worse and worse until it's too late.
Absolutely. And I heard you say something earlier about the public, that they don't truly understand the reality of corrections work. Can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
But I'll talk about county government.
Okay.
And, it wasn't too long ago where correctional officer pay was, below standards, and it wasn't enough to really make it a career, right? There's a certain level of pay where you go from being a job to being a career. And correctional officers hadn't had in our area, a raise in a long, long time. And it's up to the county board to make sure that we're keeping up with the cost of living, and that the profession is recognized for what it is. And the county board, I don't feel at the time, and this is years ago. So if there's any current county board members listening, I'm not talking about you. So, but little by little, they started to recognize the importance of the job, that how we keep the public safe, how we're responsible for, we mentioned rehabilitation and making sure people don't reoffend, the toll that it takes on the lives of the correction officers. And officers would testify, before the board. The exit interviews that I mentioned was important because I could take that data before the board and say, look, we're losing people, number one, because of pay. Number two, because they don't feel appreciated, and we need to do something about that. And they started to realize, you're right. We need to elevate, the status of corrections officers. We need to appreciate them, and they did. And our staff over here, within 5-6 years, they got about a 70% increase in their pay.
Oh, wow.
And we were able to keep staff. So now, pay. And some correction officers, if they listen to this, might disagree, but pay hasn't become that issue. But it's because we had to, on our own, we had to go and advertise ourselves as being how important we are to the community. It doesn't help that if you watch TV shows and you see, and we're called guards, right?
Right.
And that term is it's offensive. We're not guards. We are correction officers because we do wear many hats as well. We're an officer, but we're also a social worker. We also give medical care,
Case manager.
CPR, case manager, absolutely. So many hats you wear throughout the day. And you never know what the day is going to bring. And again, in the end, I mean, you have to be, you're highly trained. You have to go through, weeks and weeks and weeks of training. You have to be certified by the state. You have to go through 24 hours of annual recertification. And it's about, building that public image as much as we can.
No, I mean, it sounds like you guys have made a lot of positive changes. So that leads me to my next question. What does the future of corrections culture look like? I mean, what does basically a healthy correctional culture look like for the future? I mean, in your kind of experience.
Okay, so number one, and this is probably the most difficult, it's going to be architecture. A lot of the jails that we house individuals in, they're archaic. They're not built ideally. I look at our own institution, there's no natural sunlight at all. You need specific areas for those that are in mental health crisis, something that's conducive. You probably need, areas that are, and I mentioned like natural sunlight. I think our statutes right now are DOC 350 code mentions, jails that are built now has to have a certain amount of natural sunlight filtering through. And that's important for the well-being of not only the inmates, but for the staff. And you don't look like you're going to be in a dank, dark dungeon, right, when you come into work. So architecture plays a big role in that. And it's extremely expensive, and that's going to be slow going. And we've, in our agency, our myself and the director, we've toured jails that are just miraculous. I think you walk in there and it's bright and it's got a nice airy atmosphere, and they really take care of their staff. They have a great break area. They have a lot of classrooms for the inmate population where volunteers can come in and it's fairly spacious. They have up-to-date audio visual technology. So if you're going to do a presentation to the inmates on whatever you want, right, it's state of the art. Or if you're going to have meetings with officers and you have training sessions, again, it's state of the art. You can have virtual reality training segments, and you have the space to do that. So I think it starts with architecture. And, our jail was built in 1992, and it seems like it was built in 1975 almost.
Right.
So that's something that I think it starts with that, and that's kind of out of our control. The culture of corrections also, I mentioned before in the beginning, it's rehabilitation. And we have to realize that we're going to see individuals on the street when they're released, and we want to give them the tools so that they don't reoffend, and that needs to be first and foremost.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Well, that leads us to, that was my last question for you, but before I let you go, if you could change one thing about the culture of corrections, what would it be?
Wow, what a loaded question. Just one thing about the culture of corrections.
Yeah.
I think I would like to see more of an educational piece to corrections. I would like to see some 2-year degrees out there for corrections. Eventually, if we got our staffing, up to snuff and we could afford to do that. I know we do a 5-week academy to be certified by the state, and it varies, right, from state to state. But I would like to see the educational component and the requirement for education taken to the next level.
But education, it sounds like, is what you would change. So, well, I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk about, the culture within corrections, and I feel like, I hope our audience learned a lot from you today as well. So, until next time, and for those listening, thank you for listening.
This episode of Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, was brought to you by Equivon Corrections. For more information regarding classification and/or custody management software solutions that can save your team time and mitigate your facility's risk, visit www.equivon-corrections.com.